This... I don't know what I'm more surprised by. The fact that a remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden exists in the first place? Or that it's one of the 3 Fire Emblem games coming out in this year alone. I'm not complaining, it's just... it's a lot to take in, you know?
Launching 2 years after the Super Famicom, Fire Emblem Gaiden is often considered the black sheep of the series, a claim that has become increasingly ignorant to make over the years, given how more recent entries like Awakening and Fates continue to take influence from the many design choices that Gaiden introduced, like an overworld map, branching campaigns, and fighting hordes of monsters, rather than the largely human and human-like foes of the first game. To be sure, there's no shortage of bizarre mechanics in Gaiden that were never included in the Super Famicom entries that would either cement or create series staples, almost a what-if direction for the series to take that somehow ended up being made. A scenario that is doubly amusing when one remembers that Intelligent Systems was making a straight-up Fire Emblem JRPG on the Wii, but that's a story for another day. Shoso Kaga, in an attempt to address the criticisms lobbed at the very first Fire Emblem game, decided to incorporate elements from traditional Japanese role-playing games as a means of granting the player more freedom and having them be more engaged with the characters in the sequel. A decision whose impact on Gaiden's design becomes noticeable from the very first screen as the player takes control of Am and discovers they can roam around their starting village grid-free and talk to its inhabitants a la Final Fantasy before setting off for their first encounter via the overworld. Gaiden had no shortage of good ideas, but the execution was... lackluster to say the least. Living up to its title, this side story to the original didn't know whether it wanted to be a tactics title or a JRPG, the end result being a boiled-down hybrid with neither the thoughtful gameplay of the former or the grand scope and character focus of the latter.
Gaiden has certainly aged better than its predecessor, but that's not saying a whole lot. Compared to the likes of Seisen no Keifu, Rekka no Ken, Path of Radiance, or even the similarly designed Sacred Stones, well, pales in comparison doesn't quite do it justice. Still a better game than Radiant Dawn, though.
However fascinating its ideas may have been, Gaiden's more outlandish editions were never given the chance to be properly explored in future entries. Luckily, Intelligent Systems decided to revisit them with a remake in the form of Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadows of Valentia for the Nintendo 3DS. Of all the Fire Emblem games to start off this presumed line of remakes, well, Sacred Stones is closer to Awakening and Fate than Gaiden is in terms of design, but still, Gaiden is the evolutionary predecessor of what constitutes modern Fire Emblem and represents one of the more interesting entries in the series. Also, Sacred Stones is readily available via the Virtual Console in North America, whereas Gaiden has never been released in the West. As an aside, is every localized remake going to involve shadows in the title in this series? Should we be looking forward to Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of... oh god, why? Anyway, does Shadows of Valentia illuminate any of the bright ideas from one of Fire Emblem's most overlooked games? Or was this part of the series best left in the dark? Let's find out. Before we get to Shadows of Valentia's story, let's talk about the originals.
No, that wasn't a rendering error. There really is no story to Gaiden.
Okay, that might be a bit harsh. There was a story, but it was pretty vague and poorly told, even factoring in the technical limitations of the time. Characters were wholly devoid of personality or motivation, aside from the two main leads, to say nothing of the overall lack of development or relationships they share. Encounter after encounter would occur with no narrative to tie them together, and what little that did exist was utterly lacking its substance. All in all, it's not one of the better tales that Fire Emblem has told. With that in mind, it's surprising to see Shadows effortlessly form so strong a narrative out of such weak source material. It takes the original skeleton and plasters on piece after piece of flesh, leading off a duo of connected campaigns with a young man named Dom training with his grandfather Mycen in the obscure location of Ram Village, one who longs to make a difference in the land of Valentia, namely by protecting its people. As it so happens, an opportunity arrives in the form of a resistance group known as the Deliverance visits the elusive village looking for Mycen's aid in their battle against Regel's forces. After his grandfather declines to volunteer, Am decides to join the Deliverance along with several of his childhood friends, eventually becoming the head of this resistance and leading them right to Regel's borders. At the same time, his childhood friend Celica ventures on a pilgrimage to Milla's Tower following the king's death in order to understand why the once bountiful lands of Sophia, blessed by the goddess Milla herself, have run barren, all the while a mysterious cult of arcanists who worship the god Duma harass her and her comrades on their lengthy journey. While the simplicity of the original remains intact, the amount of substance is accentuated in every conversation the writers can muster, taking advantage of every opportunity to cram in more color into a character's background. Like Shadow Dragon, a new prologue was added to serve as both a tutorial and to grant greater insight into the history of the characters' relationships, namely how Alm and Celica ended up being separated in an attempt to emphasize how heartbreaking it must have been for those two to have been apart for so long. Unlike Shadow Dragon, there's a concerted effort to develop all the classic cast while adding in new characters that aren't locked away in side chapters that require you to kill off half of your army just to recruit them. Set characters in Shadows of Valentia are such natural additions that one wouldn't suspect that they weren't in the original unless they knew that prior to playing. In general, the writing is coherent and thoroughly engaging, full of humor exchanges both in and out of the newly created supports. Likewise, the memory presence one can find further paints in the background for minor characters, even those that were treated as nothing more than a glorified cameo from the first game. Delving into the lengthy amount of events that led into the main plot, while the occasional small talk in town serves as a nice break from the monotony of battle. Even the villains manage to be compelling. Berkut is a fantastic foil for given the former selfish lust for power, adherence to authority, and mockery of anyone not of noble birth. It makes for a solid contrast to defending the downtrodden without a second thought, and measuring people by their merit, by their actions, rather than their birth status. Though Jenna may be connected to one of the more infuriating parts of the script, their attempts to present such nefarious intents as noble are astoundingly entertaining. Yes, clearly the pale-skinned sorcerer who attacks people using an evil eye is on the level. Next thing you'll be telling me is that Ashnard has reasonable foreign policies. Speaking of the two big bads, the dual campaign in Shadows has far more synergy than any previous attempt in the series. Where Secret Stone separate chapters sacrifice character development and were generally disconnected from one another, here we have two completely different campaigns whose events complement the overall story, making the conclusions in Shadows of Valentia all the more emotionally satisfying when we see how each side unfolds and the effect that they have on the other campaign, particularly the main leads. Alm and Celica's constant display of concern for one another adds a level of relatability that no other familiar or familiar-like relationship has managed to capture since Lynn and her grandfather in Rekka no Ken. There are minor mishaps to be found within the narrative, however, most of them are structural missteps that are carried over from the previous 3DS games rather than original faults in Shadows of Valentia. The game opening via an out-of-context cutscene from later on has lost all sense of intrigue, not that the payoff this time around redeems it when the twist is almost identical to the one featured in Awakening. The continued abandonment of boss battle conversations isn't so egregious a loss this time around, given the many interactions the main antagonists have with Alm, Celica, and their respective company, but missed opportunities for character development still arise during these encounters. During Alm's journey to the Sluice Gate, a mage named Luthier joins him, as Luthier requires their help in freeing his younger sister from the control of an Arcanist named Tatara. When meeting this abusive Arcanist on the battlefield, Luthier's response to him is to have no response because he says nothing to Tatara. This confrontation could have been used to showcase his rage for such an inhuman action taken against somebody he cares about, or express his disappointment in being unable to protect his sister, the latter of which could have tied nicely into his awareness of his mediocre magical prowess in comparison to his prodigy of a sibling. Not to say that either of those are the only options that could have been taken in this hypothetical conversation, or that either aspect goes unexplored, mainly that for a game that so thoroughly takes advantage of an opportunity to flesh out its characters, it's surprising to see this golden opportunity be completely ignored.
If there is a glaring flaw in this new narrative, it's going to require going into spoiler territory to divulge, so for those who don't want to be spoiled, you know the drill. Right, let's talk about Celica, and how unbelievable her actions in Shadows of Valentia truly are.
While there were positive changes made to her character, it's hard to understand why the writers decided to make Celica's actions as moronic as the one she partakes in during her portion of the 2's campaign. During the reunion, Celica escalates her concern for Alm taking on the Regalian Empire into berating him for taking up a position as leader of the resistance because he's not of noble heritage and therefore shouldn't be in a position of leader? What? It's understandable that the two would disagree given what they faced up to that point. Celica's concern for the safety of somebody who she sees as a brother is, in of itself, relatable, and there are moments throughout her campaign where she effectively expresses this emotional distress, but the anger and reasoning she displays in this scenario is completely out of proportion, given Alm's reasonable position on why he chose to, and continues, to lead the fight against Regel's forces.
Maybe you should go become king if it's such a damnably easy job!
What? Celica, that's not...
You're awfully free with accusations for a boy with no idea what royalty entails. And now that you're a hero, I imagine the throne is next on the list, is that it?
Where is this coming from? At this point in the story, Alm's sole goal is to protect the people of Valentia by driving back the invading forces, not to conquer them and become their emperor. It's the same character motivation as Captain America in the first Avenger.
Do you want to kill Nazis?
I don't want to kill anyone.
I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from.
It doesn't matter what sort of man he is. The Regalian Empire chose to cross Zophia's border. That's a fact. We aim to drive back the invaders. Nothing more.
The only reason that takes up the position of Emperor in the penultimate act is because he's later discovered to be the son of Emperor Rudolf and thus heir to his throne. Not because he sought to take the crown by force or that he thought being the leader of a country would be easy, something that he points out when he talks to Berkut. Even then, he treats the position more as an extension of his current duty to the people of Valentia rather than inheriting his birthright. Put simply, there was absolutely no reason for Celica to react the way she did. However, that's not where this trail of trite decision-making ends. See, later on it's revealed that Celica's soul is needed by Varen no peace trustworthy Von Jetta. In return for her cooperation, he promises to release Milla and leave Alm alone. Whatever credit one can give Celica for questioning his trustworthiness or the value of the deal is immediately dropped when she refuses to tell any of her friends about this incident, refuses to tell her brother Conrad about this bargain, despite him doing nothing but protect her this entire time, and puts them all in grave danger as Jetta threatens to kill their companions when Celica wants to evaluate the validity of his claims, saying that,
"But I've no fondness for interruptions, and they've proven the meddling sort. I trust you will forgive me for being cautious."
And yet, in spite of this highly suspicious action, and a vague threat towards she still decides to meet with him in Duma Tower, yet again putting her friends' lives at risk as they ascend it, without telling them a single thing about this potential bargain. I think she's competing with Corrin for the Dumbest Protagonist Award.
Upon ascending Duma, it's revealed that Milla can't be released because she was sealed away by the Falchion. Despite this complete act of deception, she still trusts his bargain and goes along with him. Oh, and then Jetta warps her friends away. Again, she puts up barely any resistance and still goes along with his plan, going so far as to defend him when reuniting once more with who rightfully wants to put an end to the head of this delusional cult. She only questions him when she's all alone about keeping up his end of the bargain, of which he's unable to uphold. A shocking development to absolutely no one. Except Celica herself.
Cease your lamentations and come along, girl. I'll send the boy to you shortly. That I can promise.
No, not Alm! You swore to leave him alone!
He is lying. He has done nothing but lie to you this entire time. He has continued to make multiple threats in regards to Alm's life before this conversation took place. There is absolutely no reason that any of this should come across as a surprise to you, knowing all of that.
The idea seems to be that, by framing the two characters' campaigns as opposing ideologies and drawing a parallel to Duma and Milla, the brand-bearing twins would be seen as equals, two different approaches to resolving the same conflict, i.e. Alm preferring the battlefield and Selma diplomacy. Instead, Shadows of Valentia repeats Fate's mistakes by attempting to present both sides as equals, while having one of the two's actions be irrational at best. Not to mention that the parallel between the mortal twins and their respective deities doesn't stick when you have Alm risking his life and his own troops to save a single person, and not a noble at that, whereas Duma is characterized as anything but caring. In spite of Celica's imbecilic actions, Shadows of Valentia has no shortage of emotion-evoking moments or memorable characters scattered throughout its main narrative, making it, surprisingly, the most fulfilling story the series has told on the 3DS. Unlike the story, Shadows of Valentia's gameplay can be best described as a balancing act caught between faithfully recreating Gaiden's experimental nature and updating its more interesting ideas with a more proper execution. As an example, with each character having a single slot for equipment, the best strategy was to simply equip the most powerful compatible weapon and plow through the horde of foes. Shadows fixes this by introducing skills for certain weapons that allow for a deeper level of strategy and careful consideration for which character is best suited to a given item. On that same note, the simplistic villages and castles in the original, with their low populations and lack of explorable territory, were hardly worth wasting one's time visiting outside of occasionally advancing the plot forward. SOB's solution, outside of the aforementioned additional dialogue, is to include blacksmiths that allow new weapons to be created from old ones or improving older equipment, with the goals you gain from beating enemies, in addition to uncovering items and memory prisms with these Phoenix Wright-like examinations. While the latter are somewhat awkward, these make the villages a welcome break from the usual string of battles, Rather than the boredom-inducing excursions they were in its prior incarnation. This isn't to say that every aspect of Gaiden is morphed to match modern standards. If anything, there's much that one has to unlearn from the hundreds of hours poured into previous entries, be it conveniences one has grown accustomed to in the previous 3DS entries, or series staples like the Weapons Triangle, or mazes being able to cross sand with little hindrance. While classes have been changed from game to game, Gaiden features some of the more unique variations, like archers being able to attack from up close, and from upwards of 3 spaces away, or magic users sacrificing some HP to cast spells, in addition to learning new, occasionally semi-exclusive ones as they level up. While the radical redesigns take some time to get used to, they pair shockingly well with the aforementioned skills, and the unmentioned branching character promotions via the villagers to provide a flexible and fun roster that's ripe for experimenting with different strategies on the battlefield. Having said that, there are times where Shadows preserve the original's ideas too well, where there hasn't been enough tweaking to make them fresh. While exploring dungeons no longer features random encounters, they nevertheless remain clunky and awkward to navigate, not to mention hardly ever rewarding, outside of the extra experience and the occasional stat-boosting fountain. Promotion being based on Milla's statue seems like a solid alternative to the usual reliance on second seals or Elysian whips or other items, until you realize how often you'll have to venture into a cavern to find one. The most prominent example of this preservation effort is the map design. Leaving aside the constant recycling of a single cemetery map in Celica's path, what original maps that exist consist of large and sparse areas with little thought behind their structure and even less strategy beyond the occasional terrain advantage. Combine that with the less than stellar AI and, well, chances are if the route-heavy objectives and overly simplistic mech design deterred you in Awakening, it'll be equally bothersome in Shadows of Valentia, since enemies are prone to simply swarming your units with no regard for any claim made in the name of superior terrain. Also, while the original was far from Thracia's 776 levels of difficulty, it's hard to recall it ever being so forgiving. That last one isn't necessarily a criticism, more an observation. Friends will fall, this is Fire Emblem after all. But additions like Milla's Turnwheel offer a suitable substitute to a hard reset when a unit dies, or gets a bad level up, and Revival Springs remove any worries about progress in the dungeon being undone due to an unlucky encounter when the wheel ends. That's not to say there isn't any challenge in Gaiden. If anything, Shadows features one of the more unique approaches to difficulty in the entire series. Remember Chapter 13 of Conquest, where you could exploit the AI in order to grind a given character to the point where they can literally change classes due to the experience they've earned? There's a similar encounter early on in Gaiden, however the difference is that this was intended by the designers, at least one presumes. In the conclusion of the first act, the player has the choice of defeating one of 2 bosses, Desace or Slade. Slade is a pushover with no real reward beyond the usual experience, but Desace's heavy damage output, in conjunction with their defensive and healing abilities, makes him exceptionally difficult to take down. What makes fighting him so enticing is also what makes him a challenge, as the Draco shield he drops upon defeat boosts even the weakest unit into a potent tank. Plus, it helps compensate for the lack of healers early on in Om's route, as it grants the equipped unit the ability to heal every turn. The player has to be clever and lure him away from the main forces in order to stand a chance, get him in range of what limited troops they have at the ready, and surround him so he can't escape. Namely, since if he's low on health will run away, and if he's not moved outside of Slade's range, the latter will move into attack, and ruin any chance that one has of getting their hands on Desace's Draco shield. It's an excellent way of presenting an alternative challenge that rewards clever players for the mastery of the mechanics, and making the most of every unit's abilities, or for grinding if they decided to do that, with one of the best pieces of equipment in the entire game. One that will easily see usage up to and including the final chapter. On a similarly impressive note, notice what happens after Celica and Om's reunion turns bitter, and the two leave on less than favorable terms, followed by a natural event that separates the two paths from crossing in the entire game. While not particularly subtle, it's an effective method of showing that this meeting has divided our heroes and driven them away from one another, with no recourse for reparations regardless of the fact that they both have the same goals. Thus, they literally have to take different paths, only to grow further apart the longer they march. It's fascinating to see such an early example of the series telling its story through gameplay. Moments like these are where Shadows of Valentia fully capitalizes on the original's experiments and produces some brilliant results. For Intelligent Systems to craft its best remake thus far, out of perhaps the most uneven entry in the entire series, is an impressive feat on its own. That it manages to maintain this balancing act of preserving the original's design while updating the mechanics to be more beginner-friendly and enjoyable is all the more impressive. Though the gameplay garnered a gargantuan set of improvements, the presentation doesn't boast quite as impressive an overhaul compared to the previous 3DS outings. Its captivating animation and combat is on par with Awakening and Fate, boasting some subtle additions like grass slicing when a character draws their weapons, and unique victory poses for characters that helps reinforce their personalities, but the once gorgeous cutscenes are marred with uncanny movement, along with a lack of dynamic lighting. While not quite an eyesore, they're nowhere near as detailed as the ones that came before it. Not that the 3DS's subpar screen helped much. For that matter, the lack of in-game cutscenes hurt the more comedic moments like rushing in to attack a group of brigands after being advised to evaluate the situation. As for the character art, while Hidari's work is an improvement over Kosaki's effort in Awakening and Fates, and a stark improvement over the original, the continued objectification of the women in Fire Emblem reaches peak creepiness with the Escher girls as posing a Matilda in a scene where she is explicitly a prisoner of war. And this is how the artist decided to render that scene. Kosaki or not, keep it classy. Namely by never doing anything like this again. On the plus side, a huge plus I might add, the voice acting isn't limited to the usual set of grunts and grunt-worthy puns, with nearly all major lines of dialogue receiving sublime performances normally reserved for Atlas's affairs, and the soundtrack is a superb resurrection of one of the more overlooked set of tracks in the series' history. Right by one of the original's wrongs and included an incarnation of the Fire Emblem theme. What it lacks in ambition, Shadows of Valentia makes up for with its polished gameplay and complete reconstruction of an immensely messy, if original entry in the series, put together in one visually appealing and elegant sounding package. A high mark for a series that has proven itself to be a high mark for the presentation in its tetralogy of titles.
If this is the final entry in the series to hit the 3DS, it's a good one to go out on. Easily the best remake that Nintendo has published since, Metroid Zero Mission. Hopefully this does well enough to warrant Intelligent Systems bringing back more echoes of the series' past. You know, like that one that you teased us with some 15 years ago? The one that you had in your very first localized game teased us with an ominous cliffhanger? The one that I believe the director of this game has said that they are interested in remaking? Just saying. But until that fateful day, and until next time, game on, my friends.